Hello everyone! I've been receiving requests to upload some real-time videos and to explain more in depth the process of using colored pencils on black paper. So here it is. This video is not entirely real-time because it would make a very long video. So I decided to speed up the parts that would be redundant, where I've already explained the process and shown you how to do it for quite a while in real time. But each time I started working on a new part, I slowed down the video and I'll explain how it's done. So I'm not quite sure if I'll be able to talk through the whole half hour, but I'll do my best to explain to you everything that I do, and I hope it helps. If somehow you still have questions, please don't hesitate to ask in the comments below. I'll be happy to answer them. I'm also going to put the list of supplies that I'm using in the description box below. But basically, here's what I usually use. First, I use some black Stonehenge paper, which is my favorite black paper. It's 90 pounds and it's nice and thick. You can use many layers of colored pencils with it, so it's really nice. It has a slight texture to it. It's not perfectly smooth, and that's what allows it to take that many layers of pencils. Talking about pencils, I use Prismacolor Premier colored pencils. To me, they're the ones that work best on black paper, at least for my technique. The white is the most opaque white of all that I can tell. I've been doing that for years, so maybe it's just I'm just used to them. But anyway, so that's what I'm using, and I do use one black Derwent drawing pencil because it looks more matte on the paper. If I use a black Prismacolor pencil on the paper, it's going to look shiny, and I don't really like that, so I usually cover it up with a black Derwent drawing pencil. Also, I never use any erasers, and you might see something that looks like a kneaded eraser. It is not. If you use an eraser on this black paper in particular, you might damage the sheen of the paper. The surface won't be damaged, you'll still be able to use it, but if you use it in areas where you won't be covering it with colored pencils, it's going to show an uneven surface. So what I use instead is poster putty, blue tack, and I don't rub it on the paper, I just dab it, and that's great because it's a little bit tackier than a kneaded eraser, and I usually use it to pick up the little residue that colored pencils leave on your paper. And if you've been using Prismacolor pencils, you know that these leave quite a few of those little dots. Also, if you have put too much pigment on your paper, you can remove it by just dabbing the poster putty on it, and it's going to help you have enough texture again to add more layers. Then also use a drafting brush so that whatever's loose on the paper, I really brush it off rather than using my hand, because if I use my hand, it's most likely going to crush the little crumbs on the paper and leave traces of pigment. So a brush, you can use also like mopping watercolor brushes, for instance, something with soft bristles, but I have a drafting brush which is nice and big, and I've been using it for years, and it works great. And lastly, you're going to need a sharpener. I always use a handheld sharpener for my Prismacolors, just so that I can be more in control. If I have a damaged pencil, I also have a Derwent electric sharpener that works really great, and it gets it started where then I can use a handheld sharpener and the damage won't cause any problem anymore. So that's it for the supplies. Now you notice that I already had my line drawing on my black paper, and that's because I never sketch on the black paper. Like I mentioned before regarding erasers, if I make mistakes and I have to erase them, it's gonna damage the sheen of the paper and look a bit strange if I don't cover it up with pencils. So I always transfer my sketches on the black paper and I'm ready to go. Something very important you need to keep in mind is that you have to have your pencils sharp at all times. It allows to have more control of the strokes that you make and be more precise. Also, it fills in the little holes of your paper, of the texture of your paper, without pushing too hard on it, and so that you don't burnish the paper, and so that you are still able to add more layers on it. In order to end up with a richly textured drawing, you will need to add many layers, and to add many layers you need to not put any pressure on your pencils. So I don't know if you realize it when you see this footage, but I barely touched the paper. It's enough to establish my first layer and where everything is, all the feathers, and I basically draw the whole first layer in white. It helps me establish where all the major things are and will allow me later on to apply the colors by kind of blocking the black of the paper and making especially the more transparent colors a bit more opaque. So the white is very helpful for that. I rarely apply a color straight onto the black paper. It's usually on top of a previous white layer. So as you saw for the eyes, I did the same. I applied a layer of white, and in the areas that were a bit brighter, I applied a second layer to show the light more. So as I'm constantly looking at my reference picture, I just draw all the feathers in the same direction as they show on the reference picture, and just establish all the different parts of the head of the owl that way. I don't need to draw every single strand of feather or hair. Actually, especially for an owl on the head, you'll notice that it really looks like hair, like fur for an animal. So I'm just drawing little lines in all directions according to the reference picture, and that's all I'm doing, and always applying a light touch. I'm also always sharpening my pencil to make sure the tip is always sharp. And you might notice that as I'm doing this, I'm kind of drawing a few lines, and then I'm turning my pencil, and then drawing a few lines, and then turning my pencil. And I'm not even conscious of doing this anymore, but it's just that if you always do it on the same side of the pencil, then the tip on its side is gonna start being rounded. And so if you turn your pencil very often, it's going to keep the tip of your pencil sharper a little longer. And then when I sharpen it again, I only just put it in my sharpener and just turn it once. That's enough to make it sharp again. So in some areas of the head, like right here on the top, you'll see it's more like little bunches of feathers or little lines drawn in clusters, and that gives an idea of feathers. And I'm just really copying the picture at this point. And it doesn't need to be perfect, doesn't need to be precise. You still see that it's an owl, even if that one feather is not quite at the right place. You might also be wondering about that odd pencil I'm using. It is a white Prismacolor pencil. I will put a link to show you how to do this. It's basically because I don't want to waste my little pencil stubs. I glue them onto cheap graphite pencils. But I'll put a link up in the video and I'll show you how to do that if you're interested. I usually end up being able to use the whole pencil without any waste, which is pretty cool. Now around the beak, the feathers are a bit longer, so I'm drawing longer lines and try to make them wispy, I guess. Always going in the direction that I see on the picture. In some areas, some of the lines overlap each other and they give the illusion of a feather. So that's what I did. I just crisscrossed those lines, especially right under the eyes. So colored pencils is really a game of patience, and when I'm working on black paper, usually this part is the longest. Using the white pencil to establish all the different areas of the drawing is what is going to take me the longest time, because after that all you're going to have to do is add the colors on top, but you've already established the beak, the eyes, and all the feathers around, so most of the work will be done. At this point, I've done all of it, so I'm just applying the colors. Basically what you're doing is glazing. Again, don't apply too much pressure on your pencil because you want to add more layers after that to build your colors. I don't have an actual pencil that will give me the exact color of the eye, so I'm going to need to play with different colors. So I started with the sand Prismacolor pencil. And I didn't push too hard, it's just to start adding a little bit of color. Then I use a yellow ochre to add a slightly more pigmented yellow. And then I used the pumpkin orange to add the darker areas. So as you can see, I'm really going slow and I'm just adding a tint of color so that I don't ruin the paper, so that I don't burnish the whole paper, and I'll still be able to add more colors. As I keep working on the eye and referring to my picture, I adjust the colors as I see them to adjust the darks and the lights. Here I'm adding a little bit of sunburst yellow. And if there's an area with too much color, I will reapply some white so that the next color will be more visible, if that makes sense. So basically the lower part of the iris is a little bit lighter because it catches more light, and right under the eyelids, I guess, is darker. This area will be a darker orange, almost red, but because the light is caught at the bottom part of the iris, you'll see some lighter yellow that shines through. So I used the Scarlet Lake for the redder parts, the darker part, to add the shadows of the iris. Now you might notice there's a glare that's starting to form as I'm adding all those layers. The paper is getting a bit more burnished. For now it'll be okay, because later on I'm going to spray. Once I've added the colors everywhere, I will spray the drawing with a fixative spray, and it'll give me more texture to work on, and I'll be able to go over it again, and the sheen will be gone too. So basically, again, just work your eye according to your reference picture. Keep adding the colors that you see on your picture, and once you're done, take your black pencil, sharpen it really well, and you can start defining the contour of your eyes, and adding very lightly, barely touching your paper, adding the darker shadows. You need to do that on the bottom line of your iris, as well as the inside, I don't know how to explain that, where the pupil is, right under the line of your pupil into the iris, because it's gonna give a more rounded effect, and it'll give a more 3D effect to your eye. So I know that on the video you don't see the colors very well because of the sheen of the paper, but later on, after I spray the drawing, you'll see it better. So now I'm tinting the feathers. I compare with the reference picture and try to find the right colors. I'm basically glazing the feathers that I already drew with a white pencil, same as the eyes. So once more, just very light layers of colors on top of the lines that I had already drawn. Sorry for the off-screen part. Sometimes when I zoom in too much, this happens. Once I've added a few layers of colors, I take my white pencil again and I'll go over the lightest areas of the drawing. So there are some feathers that appear white, some that are white. Then there's the highlights in the eyes. This time I apply a lot more pressure and I make sure that my pencil again is very, very sharp. I will also add a little bit more highlights at the bottom of the irises, so that later on I'll be able to add more yellow to add some kind of glow to the eyes. So yeah, I go over the whole areas where the highlights are. And sometimes I add a little bit more colors, sometimes I add some grays to show a little bit of shadows. But you can tell, especially on the beak, that I'm adding a lot more pressure now because the white is much brighter. Now you can start seeing how it's important to add all those layers because it builds up the texture and the volume of all those feathers piled up on top of each other. The drawing doesn't look flat anymore. So I've added a layer of spray fixative and let it dry, and now you can see that on top of the extra white that I added before I added the layer of fixative, I'm able to add more colors to the eyes and they pop a lot more now. You can see them better because there's no sheen that we used to see before because it was all burnished. At this point, I'm going to use the black pencil a lot more to define more details. Again, I'm going around the eyes to define the edges. And I decided to color in the pupils, even if they were already black because of the paper, because I think it kind of unifies the whole drawing. So with the black pencil, I'm also defining the feathers. So I'm kind of separating some of the white lines to define them basically and to show more details. Here around the beak, for instance, I'm adding some long strands of feathers, of hair, whatever those are, just to cut through the mass of white lines and make it less uniform. I'm also gonna define the beak better by adding more shadows on the edges and on each side where the feathers are. That way it's gonna make it stand out and look more 3D. This is my black Derwent drawing pencil. I know it doesn't look like it, but it is. It's just a tiny little stump that I have glued onto a cheap graphite pencil. Where there's a lot of shadows, that's what I use, very, very lightly. It adds a beautiful shadow effect, which I really like. Keeping in mind, again, that I'm only using it very lightly. And because it's only for shadow effects, I don't need to have it all sharpened because it's glazing some areas and I'm not trying to add details with it. The black details I add with a very sharp black Prismacolor pencil. So we're almost at the end of the drawing and I'm adding some white one more time to make sure that my values have a nice contrast. So I added a lot of black with the Derwent drawing pencil. So now I want the lighter areas to pop even more. The canary yellow that I'm adding there to add some glow to the eyes. It's a very transparent color and I wouldn't have been able to just add it onto it, so that's why I put a layer of white underneath to grab the color of that yellow. I'm also adding another layer of color throughout the feathers to make them pop a bit more, and then more highlights on some of the feathers as well. So it's basically the finishing touch, trying to work on the contrast with a nice and bright highlights and dark shadows. That's what makes your subject really pop and look 3D. I'm adding a touch of light blue to the eyes highlights because the animals, usually when you have pictures of them, especially wildlife, they're outside and there's often a reflection of the sky in their eyes, and I think a little touch of blue, not just white but a little touch of blue in the highlight makes it look more natural. So if you've worked it so hard that you don't have enough texture anymore to add any more colored pencils, again, you can use your spray fixative to add a layer of it, let it dry, and then you have a little more texture to work on it. If you really added a lot of pencil and you added the wrong color, for instance, or you want to add more of another color, use your blue tack, the poster putty, to remove a little bit, dab it onto that area and remove a bit of the pigments. It'll revive, if you want, the surface, and you'll be able to add more colors. So we're just about done. I hope this video was helpful. If you have any questions, again, really don't hesitate. I'd be happy to help. I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you all for watching. I'll see you soon. Bye bye.